For its part, China, too, has been following a more or less consistent strategy towards the United States. And this strategy, I think, was basically laid down by Deng Xiaoping in 1991 in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square incident, the First Persian Gulf War, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union, a time when China's leaders felt isolated and vulnerable. And the essential idea is embodied in the so-called 24-character strategy, which includes, among other sentences, the notion that China should hide its capabilities and bide its time. Now, this may be starting to change, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. This basic approach, I think, can be broken down into three precepts or axioms. First is avoid confrontation. I mean, China's leaders have recognized from early on that there was nothing to be gained from confrontation, certainly with the United States, that China benefited from a relatively stable international environment, in particular because political stability supported the ongoing economic relationship which has allowed China to grow. So, number one, avoid confrontation. Number two, build comprehensive national power. This is a concept that Chinese strategic analysts define in various ways, but they intend to use it to measure the total power of nations. And they believe that it needs to include all the various elements of national power. Economic power, first and foremost, military, technological, diplomatic, and most recently, Chinese analysts have also begun to talk about the importance of soft power as an element in comprehensive national power. So, number two, build China's comprehensive national power. The third axiom of this Chinese strategy, I think, has been to advance incrementally. China may be, and China's leaders may have believed it to be, on the defensive strategically in relation to the United States and its allies, whom it saw as being quite strong. But that hasn't meant that they believed that they could afford to be passive, simply to wait and build up their strength and then seek to change their situation at some indefinite point in the future. Rather, China's strategists have consistently sought ways to strengthen their own position where possible throughout Asia and increasingly around the world. And I believe also they have sought ways to weaken the position of the United States, particularly in Asia. What are the ultimate goals of this three-part Chinese strategy? This is not something that Chinese authors, officials, analysts discuss openly. And indeed, I think there's reason to believe that there may not be complete agreement among China's top leaders about what exactly the desired goals of this strategy ought to be. The approach I've just described, I think, has widespread support among Chinese elites, but it's also open-ended. It leaves some important questions unresolved. And these questions are going to have to be addressed as China's power continues to grow. And indeed, I think we begin to see some of these issues being debated by Chinese analysts and strategists. What do we want this region to look like? What ought to be our goal as regards the eventual presence or not of the United States in the Western Pacific? So although I think there is some disagreement and the strategy remains somewhat open-ended, I believe, on the basis of some analysis of Chinese writings, the statements of some Chinese officials, and also an assessment of the pattern of China's behavior, that the objective of China's current leaders, and I think also of their most likely successors, can be summarized in the following way. First and foremost, to preserve the grip on political power of the Chinese Communist Party. I believe that this aim is central to their thinking about every aspect of China's policy, domestic and foreign. As an extension of that, I believe that they also seek, in a sense, to make the world safe, not for democracy, as Woodrow Wilson said the United States should do, but to make the world safe for authoritarianism, or at least to make Asia safe for a CCP-ruled China. And doing this, in turn, requires, in the long run, that China displace the United States as the preponderant regional power. The U.S. and its democratic allies in Asia, as I've suggested, from the Chinese perspective, pose an ideological as well as a geopolitical threat to China. But, again, from the Chinese perspective, the United States is an interloper in this part of the world. It's a relatively recent arrival. If you like, the United States showed up on the scene at the turn of the 20th century after its war with Spain when it took over the Philippines, or perhaps running the clock forward, really became a major presence in East Asia after the Second World War. And again, from the Chinese perspective, the American position in this part of the world is dependent on what Chinese analysts sometimes refer to as unequal treaties with countries like Japan and South Korea. And Chinese spokesmen have said for some time that they would like to see these treaties dissolved, or at least drained of their strategic significance, with U.S. forces withdrawn from their bases on foreign soil, which, again, from the Chinese perspective, are relics of the Cold War. Chinese strategists don't believe that they can accomplish this goal quickly or through a sort of frontal assault. Rather, I think their hope is to win through fighting, win without fighting, as the phrase from Sun Tzu. Maintaining good relations with the United States, if at all possible, while building up China's power, damping down any tendencies on the part of the U.S. or its regional allies and friends to build up their own capabilities or to cooperate more closely in order to counter China's growing strength, building new multilateral institutional structures in which China is at the center and the United States is marginalized, if not excluded altogether, gradually weakening the foundation of America's alliances, and eventually creating a situation in which overt resistance to China's goals will appear to be futile, and in which the regional powers will have little choice but to reach the best possible accommodation they can with China. These are ambitious goals, and it's by no means obvious that China will be able to achieve them. But barring some fundamental change in the character of its domestic regime, I believe that this is the direction in which it is likely to move. Now, assuming for the moment that my characterization of American and Chinese goals and strategies is basically correct, over the last 20 years, over the course of time in which this competition has really taken shape, which side has made greater progress towards achieving its aims? Regarding the domestic dimension of the competition, the United States certainly has not succeeded in transforming China, at least not yet. Despite many changes in Chinese society and many challenges to domestic stability, the Chinese Communist Party remains firmly in control of the country. By comparison, China has done quite well, I think, at shaping the development of U.S. policy towards it. And it has done this in part by cultivating economic ties and other connections that ensure continuing support from influential groups in business, in academia, among former government officials in the United States for preserving the best possible relations with China. Regarding the external aspects of the Sino-American rivalry, the question of the extent to which the United States has tamed China is open to debate. And my own view, as I indicated earlier, is that American and many other analysts and officials have tended to be overly optimistic in this regard. Although it's certainly been willing to cooperate in some areas, Beijing clearly also has interests and objectives that diverge significantly from those of the United States and its regional friends and allies. And this is certainly true regarding Taiwan. That's nothing new. The future of U.S. alliances also. But I think it's true as well on issues like nuclear nonproliferation, where many people in the U.S. and elsewhere have been hopeful that China would play a major role in discouraging North Korea and then Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but where, in fact, China has done relatively little to achieve that goal. And I would say they have done relatively little, not because they necessarily favor proliferation, not because they would prefer to see North Korea or Iran get nuclear weapons, but rather because they have other interests that they rank more highly than achieving that goal, maintaining a friendly buffer state in the case of North Korea, gaining and maintaining access to energy in the case of Iran. regarding the South China Sea, where Beijing has recently reiterated its view that it has claims to virtually the entire region and the resources it contains. These are hardly the aims of a status quo power. In general, it seems likely that as China's power grows, it will feel freer to pursue more openly goals that are at odds with those of the United States and of others in Asia. And again, I think we've seen some indications of that in the last few years. What about China's efforts to establish itself as the preponderant regional power? Here again, I think the verdict is mixed and open to debate. In the military domain, for the past 20 years, China has been engaged in a rapid and sustained buildup of its capabilities, and this buildup has now begun to bear fruit. China's so-called anti-access area denial capabilities pose an increasingly serious challenge to America's long-standing regional military preponderance. And in particular, they pose a challenge to America's ability to project air and sea power into the Western Pacific, essentially at will, in order to sustain its alliance commitments. In the economic sphere, thanks largely simply to the growth of its economy, China is exerting an almost gravitational pull on all of the countries in the region. It's clearly the strongest force in continental Southeast Asia, and its influence in Central Asia is growing. And it has also, in the last 10 years in particular, established deep economic ties with the maritime states of Northeast and Southeast Asia, countries that are, by comparison to China's continental neighbors, generally more prosperous, more democratic, and in many cases are also treaty allies of the United States. Most of these countries now have China as their major trading partner. The Chinese strategists, I think, have hoped that in the long run, the development of these economic ties would carry diplomatic benefits. Not that they would pull countries like Japan out of the American orbit and into China's, but that at the very least, the existence and the importance of these economic ties would complicate the calculations even of governments that maintain formal alliance ties to the United States, making them hesitant, increasingly hesitant over time, to take actions that might offend Beijing. Nonetheless, especially in the last 3 years, and largely as a result of its own more assertive behavior, China has suffered serious setbacks in its efforts to draw other countries toward it and away from the United States. Its actions on a number of fronts has frightened many of the countries in the region, and I think made them more inclined than ever before to cooperate with one another and with the United States in trying to maintain a balance of power favorable to their interests and their continued autonomy, even as China grows richer and stronger.